Okay, over to you, Vili.
Thank you very much, Delene. I would like to welcome all our SANParks Honorary Rangers and also friends who are joining us for this evening's talk on SANParks' approach to greenhouse emissions and their strategies to go for net zero by the year 2050. I think it's a very relevant and a talk that we're really looking forward to listen to. Before I introduce our speakers for tonight, our presenters, please allow me to use this opportunity to convey our sincerest condolences to two Honorary Ranger families who lost dearest ones earlier today. First of all, to the Calditz family, Paul Calditz, the chairperson of the SANParks Honorary Rangers Board, and his family, with the loss of his wife, Kobe, also a member of the SHR, earlier today. You know, not only was Kobe a great support to Paul, but she was also a very active member for the Free State region. And we would like to share our loss, your loss as well, Christo, and the Free State region. Also, last night, we have lost a dear member, Louis Venter. He was a member from the Vaal Triangle. En ons wil ook ons innige meegevoel, Susan, aan jou en die Venter familie. Ek weet nie of jy inluister nie, maar daar kan julle dit net aan haar oordra, dat ons gebede gaan in hierdie aand uit na julle toe. So just before I introduce our speakers, I would like to discuss some house rules. We will deal with questions after the formal presentation, and I would like to invite our Zoom participants to pose their questions in the Q&A section of the webinar, of the Zoom webinar. Please don't put it in the chat box. We won't be able to deal with it from there. Friends joining us on Facebook, you are more than welcome to pose questions as a remark, and we will pick it up from Facebook and deal with those Facebook questions at the end of the presentation. Please also take note that you know, the Honorary Rangers, for those of you that are not familiar with us, we are a voluntary organization and we support SANParks in taking care of our environment. We are totally dependent on donations, and we would like to invite you to consider contributing financially to assist us in achieving our goals. At the end of the presentation, we will screen a QR code which you can log into with your cell phone or to make a donation to the SANParks Honorary Rangers, for which we will be very grateful for. So allow me to welcome our speakers for this evening at this SHR at Home webinar. And I would like to introduce them to you. I've decided I'll go for ladies first motto. So please allow me to introduce Avhavhudzani Phophe. She is employed by SANParks, the Conservation Services Department, as a landscape ecologist. She completed her master's degree in environmental science at the University of the Western Cape. And in her job, she focuses on carbon sequestration and land restoration in our arid parks. She's involved in various climate change research projects, and she has published 2 scientific articles on this subject. She also leads 2 climate change mitigation projects within SANParks. Firstly, she leads the documentation of the carbon footprint of the organization. And secondly, she is quantifying the carbon sequestration in the Tankwa Karoo National Park. Avhavhudzani represents SANParks on various technical working groups with the Department of Environmental Affairs and Forestry on climate change and on specifically air quality. Our second presenter tonight is Dr. Mmoto Masubelele. He is also employed by SANParks as a landscape ecologist. He holds a PhD in botany and plant biology with the University of Cape Town. He also holds certificates in climate change and terrestrial ecosystems and in climate change adaptation with the University of Bergen in Norway and the University of Oxford, respectively. Dr. Masubelele does research on habitat change, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and land use change in the Cape Cluster National Parks. And he represents SANParks on various national committees on climate change, adaptation, and land degradation in South Africa. So it goes without saying that both of our speakers tonight are not only well qualified, they are also experienced to address us on this very relevant subject, this being SANParks' approach to greenhouse gas emissions and to the whole issue of going net zero by the year 2050. So once again, I would like to welcome both of you with us. And I'm going to hand the floor to you, Dr. Masubelele, to take us through your presentation and to address us on this very, like I said, relevant and very interesting subject. Over to you.
Veli, can you see the presentation?
Yes, it's on the screen. So
fantastic. Thank you so much for your introduction. Good evening, colleagues. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We will be taking you through the approach that SANParks has taken when it comes to dealing with climate change mitigation. Before I start, I must say it's a whole team effort. Avhavhudzani and myself, we just do the assessments when it comes to climate change mitigation, but most of the interventions are implemented by our technical team. So when I joined SANParks, I had a discussion at some point with the CE, wherein I motivated for going to do climate change certificate at Oxford to develop a climate change program, because I felt the approach at the time was not really like a whole organizational approach, rather than individual park setting up and those who were motivated to do intervention doing so. So that's how I sort of really got deep into dealing with climate change and representing SANParks. So for today, we will just focus on climate change mitigation approach within SANParks. Thank you. The climate change obviously is driven by the increased fossil fuel burning on the planet in the recent past. What you can see on the graph is the carbon dioxide concentration or levels in the atmosphere. And what is clear is that CO2 emissions have always, when the CO2 emissions are high, the temperatures increase also becomes higher. So from, the last, since 2000 years ago, we've experienced this dramatic increase basically in CO2 due to the world's dependent, especially energy on coal. So at the current level, previously it was below 300 parts per million. Currently it sits at 420. So in the past, there's been discussions to say, is it really driven by human influence? But the recent reports by IPCC have clearly outlined and confirmed that this unprecedented increase that we're seeing is due to human activities that has led to this greenhouse gas warming, basically. When you look at the recent mitigation report, it is very clear that the net anthropogenic emissions have continued to rise. And what they clearly show in the report that was published this year, that in the last decade, the amount of emissions have continued to rise, basically. Then came COVID, and then the world came to a standstill, and people had to be, away from work and working from home. So countries globally enforced these different lockdowns, depending on the scenarios within the specific countries. Obviously, China was the first one to basically impose lockdown, and it is clear that since then the emissions went down. But however, the argument from Tollefson, this paper that was published in Nature, show that although the COVID has kept carbon emissions in 2020, but this is not by a significant much. What is argued for is that this is just only a 6% decline, basically, in carbon emissions. Another paper by Ray et al. Show that annual carbon emissions for the different continents before and after COVID vary. If you focus on Africa, you can see that prior to 2019, specifically up until 2018, on an annual average, our emissions were going up. And then in the last pre-COVID and just during COVID, there has been a decline. So, excuse me, this is what they term in terms of carbon uptake. And then if you focus in and zoom in into South Africa, it becomes clear as well that prior to COVID, we were also experiencing a similar increase. And then during COVID, we then started seeing this decline. So all that background is important, but countries, essentially what they have done is, in terms of moving all of us globally, is to within what is called the UNFCCC, which is the United Framework or Convention for Climate Change, have ratified what is called the Paris Accord. This happened in 2015. And South Africa, as a member, also has committed to dealing with its greenhouse gas emissions. The countries are all supposed to submit the nationally determined contributions. So within the one that South Africa has presented, it is clearly outlined in terms of the mitigation and adaptation goals. And South Africa often gets in trouble because on the continent, we the largest emitter, and the way we deal in terms of phasing out emissions, especially the energy emissions, is often critiqued by many experts that we are not on par, basically, to quickly turn the wheel in terms of emissions. But as you can see, interventions are always have been planned by the government. The Department of Energy has developed this integrated resources plan, which really outlines, how do we mix, we move away from the coal-dependent energy or fossil fuel intensive energy to things like renewable gas and biofuels by 2050, essentially. So obviously this is going to help us as a country in terms of reducing the carbon footprint, especially where it's really needed is in the energy sector, where Eskom plays a critical role, and their just energy transition mitigation plan is really important for the country. And what we can do as institutions or organization is to support the national movement towards going towards renewable energy. As I mentioned, coal is really the mainstay in terms of the South African energy system. Around 70% of our power comes from coal, and this has been on the rise. South Africa, in the NDC, or the National Determined Contribution, have improved the previous commitments, basically, that they put forth to the Paris Accord. So as SANParks, we started developing our own strategy to basically deal with climate change overall. We call it the Climate Change Preparedness Strategy. The strategy has these 4 objectives, and then the 5th one on communication, it comes in the form of an output. So today, our focus is on how we mitigate climate change, but there is a lot of work that's being put in by the organization in terms of especially our Conservation Services Division is helping us understand what are the implications of climate change across the organization. Then they also playing a crucial role in helping us establish ways in how we improve resilience for biodiversity, our cultural heritage, the people around our parks, and the infrastructure, our tourism, as well as revenue. How do we adapt all of those to the impact of climate change? Because as you hear from Avhavhudzani, we are not immune to this impact of climate change. Then today specifically, we want to focus on how do we reduce our carbon footprint. We're not gonna discuss the plans in terms of carbon uptake by ecosystems. We know that we in the country we play a crucial role as a carbon storage. Some of our ecosystems, including wetlands and grasslands and thickets, are very important in in helping us absorb CO2 through the intervention that we do around restoration. So the focus today, as I mentioned, is on objective 3 in how do SANParks mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. The big drive is to really get the organization to transition to green energy. The organization has put in place interventions to try and understand its energy consumption. Buzi will talk to all these other sources of emissions that also are important, but energy consumption for the nation and for us is really important. Then the other outputs that you see, I'm not gonna focus on those ones, so I'll just move on to the next slide. The technical division within the SANParks are the ones who put in the interventions. They also do the energy audits, and they have actually developed a green energy strategy with a support of the findings that we will discuss here today, Avhavhudzani and myself, in terms of the carbon footprint, but also the energy scenarios that SANParks should be following if they want to get to net zero. So the 3 main areas essentially in the strategy is to push for more energy saving on the demand side, improving efficiency, as well as reducing or replacing some of the fossil fuel intensive appliances within the organization by replacing them with renewable energy. So from here onwards, Avhavhudzani will come in and discuss the carbon footprint associated with the organization.
All right, thank you, Dr. Masubelele, and good evening to everyone. Good evening, colleagues. So I will come in, as Dr. Masubelele has already highlighted, that I will come in and show the assessment that we have done as an organization to try to mitigate and also to minimize the amount of greenhouse gases that the organization is contributing. So may you please move on to the next slide. Dr. Mmoto, please. Thank you. So South Africa has already set a target to transform to the low energy economy, where they're aiming to reduce about 34% from business as usual by 2020, and also to reduce 42% by 2025, according to the Paris Accord. So basically what they have committed is to set the emissions to peak by 2020 and plateau until 2030 and start declining from 2030. So as an organization, in 2016-2017 strategic plan, SANParks has committed itself to reduce 2% from the fossil fuel generated energy consumption year on year. So from this commitment, we set as an organization to say, let's try to calculate and know how much amount of emission we are contributing towards climate change. So you will understand that as a conservation estate, most of the people will think that we are immune to greenhouse gases. However, that is not the case. Through the activities that we do on our daily operations, we still contribute towards the greenhouse gases. On the pictures here, you can see some of the activities that as an organization we undertake, which also lead to amount of greenhouse gases emission. May you please move to the next one. Mmoto, Dr. Masubelele has already highlighted that a conservation estate, we play a bigger role in sequestering the carbon dioxide through our ecosystem. So this is some of the example of the ecosystem where we play a bigger role in sequestering or storing the amount of carbon dioxide in our ecosystem. As I've mentioned, SANParks is may you please just go back to the previous slide? As an organization, or as the SANParks, we have 4 regions where most of our ecosystem in the parks, they are able to store carbon dioxide. So we have the forest in the organization. We have thickets, the wetlands, as well as the savanna ecosystem, which can also sequester a large amount of carbon dioxide. May you please move on to the next slide? From the assessment where we did measuring the amount of the contribution from SANParks towards the global warming. So we did the assessment where we calculated the total amount of the greenhouses gases that the organization is contributing. And those are some of the documents that came out from the assessment that we conducted. On the left-hand side, those are from the report where we conducted the assessment for the entire organization for a period of 5 years. That was from 2015 until the final year 2019. And we also have the manuscript that was published on Sustainability Journal in 2021 December. I'll explain more about the processes. And the study that we conducted, it is the first assessment to our knowledge that has been published that consider the whole network of the national parks in the country. So we haven't really come across most of the studies that have done the assessment for the whole network of national parks in the country. And this assessment is also an important in an African context, since we know that most of the assessment has been done in the Northern Hemisphere, such as US parks and also the Canada. And there is a big gap in knowledge, considering that the role that conservation estate play as a tourism hub for the entire country globally. So I will just highlight the 3 objectives that we wanted to achieve by doing this assessment. So we wanted to account for the greenhouse gas emission for the SANParks profile at the organizational level, as well as the individual park level. And we will also be able to develop some recommendation in order to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. And the third objective were to suggest the alternative scenarios that SANParks could follow to achieve the zero energy emissions. So on the scenarios, we only focused on the electricity consumption or on the energy consumption, since it showed to be our biggest culprit from the organization. You can move to the next slide. The assessment that we conducted covers 20 national parks. So the map here just shows the national parks that we have, excluding the recently declared national parks. So we have 20 national parks that we looked at. And on the assessment, we also include the Groenkloof National Park, which is in head office at our corporate offices. And we also include the Kimberley office. In the assessment, we followed the greenhouse gases protocol for the corporate measuring and reporting standard methodology. So this methodology is one of the most recommended methodology where most of the organization, including the conservation organization, are using to measure their amount of greenhouse gases. So the greenhouse gases protocol allows you to define the boundaries in the organization or in the company that you are doing the assessment on. So on the assessment that we did, we considered all scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So whereby scope 1, it accounts for the emissions that are coming from the sources that are controlled by the organization or managed by the organization. Whereas scope 2, it is the emission that is coming from the purchased electricity. In this case, those are the emissions that are coming from ESCOM bills, that are coming from the municipality bills. So scope 3 is those emissions that are happening in the organization but they are done by the other sources. So as for the assessment that we conducted for the entire SANParks, we considered both scope 3. However, according to the greenhouse gases, it is not mandatory to report or to account for scope 3, but in the assessment, we did consider both scope 1 and scope 2 and 3. Thank you. Can you move to the next? As from our first objective, it was to quantify the amount of the greenhouse gases for the entire organization at an organizational level. So this is the results that we got from the assessment. You can see here clearly that the total amount of the greenhouse gases was about 73,702 tons of CO2 equivalent. And we can see on the diagram here that the biggest contributing was from electricity, which accounts for about 50% of the total SANParks emission, and it was followed by the fuel consumption. And through the assessment, we noticed that all this fuel consumption that account to this amount of tons of CO2 equivalent, they were mostly used for generating energy mostly on the rural or mostly on the remote parts. And thirdly, it was waste. And when you add up together all this contribution from the 3 biggest contributors, they all account to almost 90% of the total carbon footprint for the organization. And we also looked at how does it contribute towards the country. So we're contributing about 0.01% towards the country emission using the assessment from 2018. Thank you. You can move to the next one. Still from the objective 1, we said we're gonna account for greenhouse gas emission organizationally and as well as individually per park. So this map highlights the biggest contributing parks. So I will just focus on the 7 biggest contributing parks. So you can see the one highlighted in red, orange, as well as green, where you can see Kruger. Kruger was was the top contributing park towards the SANParks total emission, and it accounted for almost 50% of the organizational carbon footprint. And we also have Kalahari as one of the biggest contributor, of Rabis, Garden Route, Ado, and we also have the Golden Gate as one of the biggest 7 contributors. May you please move to the next one? As I've mentioned that we follow the greenhouse gases protocol and we accounted for all 3 scopes. So on this graph, it shows the different sources. So we have sources on the scope 1, which was covered by SANParks vehicle, as well as the fuel that were used on the generator for generating energy. Scope 2, we had electricity. And then scope 3, we have waste and employees vehicle. But for now, I will just concentrate or focus on mostly contributed emission. And you can agree with me that the electricity was the biggest contributor throughout in all the 7 biggest contributing parts. And then it was followed by fuel. And if you can look at Kruger at the bottom, fuel and electricity, they were most of them in the same range. So fuel was also leading on that Kruger into that map. You can move on to the next slide, please. After doing that assessment, we also thought, okay, let's look at the total SANParks emission by looking at the total building size. And we also looking at the per capita, where we're looking at the contribution from each employees. So when you're looking at the graph on your left, where it shows the total greenhouse emission per park to the building size, you can see that there was energy intensity was very high for Kruger. And then, but whatever, when you look at the other 7 contributing parks. You can see that most of the 7 contributing parks, from the 7 contributing parks, they had a high energy intensity. And when we're looking at the per capita, we found out that Kruger and Ochrabi's Falls National Park was among the top contributing emitters per capita. And then, however, when we're looking at the least one, we found out that Mapungubwe National Park, as well as Kemdibu and Namakwa, were on the least contributing parks. May you please move to the next one? And we also thought, let's check the relationship between the total SANParks greenhouse gases emission when we compare the relationship between the total and the size of the park with the size of the building, the number of the employees, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So from the graph here, you can see that scope 2, which is written as S2, was the one which was more significantly related to the total number of greenhouse gases that the SANParks was contributing, and it was followed by number of employees, which is labeled as labor, followed by the building size, which is labeled as built, and then scope 3 and scope 1. We couldn't really find the relationship between the total number of greenhouse gases emitted by SANParks with the size of the park. Thank you. From here, Dr. Masubelele will take you through the energy scenarios that we constructed. Thank you.
Thank you, Vudzi. We thereafter thought about ways to really galvanize and move the organization towards reducing its carbon footprint, its energy footprint. And in terms of the energy, we designed this 6 scenarios, or 5 scenarios essentially, where the first one is business as usual. The idea was that, we rather use, since we are a national park, we need to find animals that mimic the type of drive that we want to see, especially when you look at the first one, where our assumption is that with the male lion scenarios, that they just come and they do most literally nothing, and the females are the ones that do most of the hunting. So we're saying here SANParks is just doing nothing and is still relying on Eskom by 2050 at around 80%. So these were all designed relative to that integrated resources plan of 2019 that I mentioned earlier by the Department of Energy. So then the 1% that you see there, it was the rate of emissions increase, energy emission increase per year. So this was the national, but also the SANParks one based on our calculation. And then we said, okay, if we start doing minimally and reducing by the rate that we're seeing an increase in, so this amounts to essentially a reliance on Eskom reduced to from 80 to below 65%. So we're saying, ideally, we're playing the waiting games where we, depending on opportunities, we add renewables into the mix, and we do minimal in terms of energy efficiency. Then we would be tracking that op web spider, like playing the waiting game, basically. And then SANParks had already, as Avhavhudzani mentioned, that SANParks had committed itself already to reducing emissions by 2%. This was actually in line with the IRP5 scenario of the Department of Energy, which SANParks had proposed it will follow. And in this scenario, we're saying SANParks will reduce its reliance on Eskom from from essentially 65 to 40%. In the next scenario, the dolphin scenario, this is it was the recommended rate at the time by UNEP, but also it's actually the best case scenario in the integrated resources plan of the Department of Energy. And we looked at those two scenarios, which is IRP1 and IRP7. So, however, when we developed these scenarios, we were not using the approach that Avhavhudzani mentioned earlier, the peak, plateau, and decline approach that the government is following. So we just wanted a continued rate, basically, instead of peak, plateau, and decline approach. So here we're saying by 2050, SANParks would be relying on Eskom by less than 20%. And we term that the dolphin scenario. Basically, this is the most efficient one because the dolphins are quite efficient hunters. And then the last one, it's the peregrine scenario, which would be the fastest. This one will get us to carbon neutral by 2030, essentially. So in this instance, the peregrine falcon, which is the fastest bird, will take us basically as SANParks to carbon neutral fastest by 2050. And the proposed decline is like 40%. And in this kind of scenario, obviously, a huge amount of resources will have to be galvanized by the organization very quickly, because implementing renewable energy is very costly. So what we did as well is to work out the cost, how much it will cost for SANParks if they do nothing at this 1% increase rate, or at the 1% decline all the way to the 40% decline. So we also worked out cost based on how much it was costing the specific park, or basically the average, in this instance, the average for the whole of SANParks, how much it cost them to pay for a ton of CO2, which was at the time around 2020 was 2019 was 1,274 rands basically per ton. So Avhavhudzani has showed you how much the total emissions is in terms of energy, where it's like 40,681 tons of CO2 equivalent. The cost that SANPark was spending at the time basically was 51,833,622 numbers. And so if you look at the picture in terms of the graphics, it is clear that if we do nothing, the first graph showing by 2025, if we're doing nothing by then, we will see an increase of more than 3 million basically in the amount that we're paying for electricity, or we're paying towards Eskom. So these costs don't include, like, we didn't actually include the energy costs associated with fuel. So you can imagine if the organization continue to spend more also on fuel, then that the cost for the organization will continue to rise basically. And we've seen the impact of COVID-19 basically on the organization in terms of it's, not having people in the parks, having an impact on our finances. So whatever we can do, basically, as you can see with the 1% scenario, a decline in emission of 2,000 tons of CO2 associated with a decline in cost is almost 3 million, then it tells you that, you know, we really need to get going when it comes to implementing some of these proposed scenarios. So at the current rate that SANParks has proposed, we'll see by 2025 a decline in emission of 5,265 tons, and the decline in cost associated to that would be about close to 7 million, basically. So by 2030, if you look at the business as usual in terms of the Lion compared to the SANParks one, it becomes very clear that the cost will continue essentially to rise for SANParks if they don't do anything. But if they do something, a huge decline in cost is estimated by 2050. So for now, I would need you to focus on basically the middle one at the bottom, which really tells us over the whole time period how much emissions and costs will be incurred or saved by SANParks. So yeah, by 2050, we should see a 15 million more spend on Eskom electricity, but this doesn't even take into account the increasing rate of emission of energy, basically, that Eskom charges. So if you know, if you calculate with the increasing rate, I would imagine the cost will be even much higher. And overall, we're saying that almost 30% increase in cost if we don't do anything under the Lion scenario. And then for the Web Spider, which is the 1% decline, we'll see a 23% decline. For the current interventions that have been put in place by SANParks for gunning for 2%, I mean, then almost 50% decline is expected in terms of cost. And for the dolphin scenario, almost all of the emissions in SANParks are eliminated by 2050. So we came to the conclusion that for SANParks, essentially, the target should be going for that dolphin scenario, essentially. So post the report, now we got interested in understanding how has the pandemic actually impacted SANParks. As I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has affected all globally, most of the people and institutions and global countries in the world. The energy sector is also one of those that was impacted. The tourism sector, as I mentioned, was also impacted. So it was, you know, based on this graphics, you can see that in some countries, the decline in electricity consumption was due to COVID. And the authors in this paper suggest that the confinement, some of the interventions include lockdowns, were really key in terms of reducing the energy consumption globally. If one wants to read more about this, they can go read on the what is called the IRENA. IRENA is they are responsible for developing reports on energy globally, and I think South Africa also is part of that group. The International Energy Agency also developed this type of reports in terms of, you know, what's happening, what's the impact of COVID on the finances that is needed for renewable energy, what is its impact on the energy consumption, what is its impact on the like individual countries, but also as globally, what would be the key interventions that would be compromised? Because previously countries had developed these measures, but COVID threw a spanner basically into the on the table, and then this really has really impacted the way in which we approach dealing with energy greenhouse gas emissions. So in this instance, I wanted to just show you the energy consumption for SANParks overall from the time we started the assessment in 2014 until 2021. So what you can see clearly is that drop in energy consumption during the beginning of COVID in March, and it stabilized basically until August, September, when we started seeing an increase basically in the parks. So what also is important for you to notice is that the different parks, there's a variation in seasonality in terms of energy consumption between the different parks. For example, in Golden Gate, there's a clear increase in emissions linked in energy consumption, basically linked to winter. So for other parks like Okravis, the red line at the bottom, or the dark orange line at the bottom shows the fact that December to February is a critical point where tourism numbers also pick up basically in the park. So if you zoom into the change that I was describing previously by putting in the different lockdown levels that the country implemented, excuse me, it is clear that the hard lockdown led to the decline. But when we come to the more lax level 2 and 1, that's when we started seeing the emissions starting to pick up again. And in few of the parks, we're starting to see the increase in energy consumption, sort of trying to get to the pre-COVID levels. So it is obviously, for the parks, it varies because at some of the parks, they open their offerings in terms of accommodation and stuff in different times during the hard lockdown. So that also can affect the energy consumption in the different parks. What we did that we didn't do previously with the first assessment was to say we need to, because of the fact that we didn't have tourism in the park, we really need to delineate between emissions associated with park infrastructure, including staff houses, like water pumps and staff accommodation. So all those things, we took the meters and then separated them from those meters that were responsible for tourism offerings, including gates and accommodation for tourists. So from the results, it became clear, if you look at the 4 parks that we could separate, we couldn't do it for Table Mountain because of the format that we received the data from the city of Cape Town, but we can clearly see that emissions declined basically in all of the parks, but where we're picking up a significant decline is in tourism emissions rather than in staff emissions, pre-COVID versus during COVID. Then if you look at Kruger, Kruger on the other hand, it's the only park where the pre-COVID emissions became significantly reduced, basically. So when we further look into the results, comparing the pre and post-COVID, it became very clear that the emissions from energy are tracking the global average. Basically, the global average sits around 23%. So that is like basically comparing pre and during COVID. So on average, if you look at the 7 parks, we're seeing a 20% decline due to COVID. Garden Route led the way, and the Kruger was the least out of the 7. So what is the take home from this is that the COVID-19 has taken us, forward in terms of implementing the proposed 8% year-on-year based on the dolphin energy scenario that I presented earlier. So it will be crucial that we maintain the gains, and this should go hand when we see the increase in tourism, we shouldn't be seeing a drastic jump in emissions. So we really ask everybody to play their part. I know you will come to our parks, and when you are in our parks, please help us in terms of reducing our energy efficiency. Buzi will talk to some of the interventions that you can do in terms of helping us after after I present a few slides. Then SANParks, where it has to play a critical role, is really implementing its green energy strategy. So this was the hierarchy developed in the energy strategy. So the big focus right now would be on changing, behavior, especially focusing on energy saving. Before we did the assessment, a lot of energy appliances were older, and the type of lighting that was used as well was a lot more older. And we've seen a commitment from the technical team in terms of supplying most of the national parks with the LED bulbs to really help us improve saving energy. And then this also has played a crucial role in terms of improving our energy efficiency. So those are the sort of the main areas according to the SANParks strategy that would be focused on. But when one look at the post-COVID situation, it is clear that although this hierarchy still holds, the prioritization of renewable would really elevate and push us further to net zero before 2050. So a lot of funding is required. Those who can work with national parks in supporting these initiatives, they are welcome to contact myself and Ronnie, who's our green energy strategy champion. And we will really appreciate support where we can, where you can, basically. Yeah. So the main areas in terms of the strategy, like I mentioned, is basically energy saving, replacing fossil fuels, and then pushing for getting more funding to implement this green energy strategy. The outputs that have been outlined within this strategy, because of the time, I just didn't think it will be important to look through all of those different interventions. Some of them include basically campaigns on communicating what we do, improving energy efficiency. We will continue to do the energy audits as SANParks and finding ways to reduce the carbon footprint. So this is I just extracted from the strategy where costs are involved in terms of how much money would really push us to going towards carbon neutral, especially implementing renewable energy in some of our parks. So within the green energy strategy, obviously it will continue to be revised after every 5 years. But if we could, raise at least close to 20 million, we could actually push this interventions of changing the solar geysers, especially because most of the emissions are, if you look at it, even if you look at the carbon intensity that Lucy presented, are associated with heating and cooling. So the changing solar geysers within our parks will really help us go a long way. And if we could get that kind of money to implement, then that will be fantastic. And from now on, Buzi will just focus on the what we can do, what you can do as well to support us in this endeavor.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Masubelele. So I will come in as to answer the question and also highlight on what can we do in order to contribute into reducing the amount of greenhouse gases emission, and maybe by also looking at how as an individual we can contribute towards mitigating the amount of greenhouse gases, and as well as looking at the organizational level. So here are some of the icons that I used to just give a brief description of what can we do as an organization and as well as an individual. So on the further left up, and then one of the things that we can do as an individual is also to avoid the tumble dry and try to hang our clothes or our laundry on the sun and dry them in a natural way. And moving forward to the left, it's also, as I've already highlighted, that as an organization, we have noticed that the fuel consumption that has been used for generator to generate electricity was among the biggest contributor. It will be also great to move as an organization from a fuel consumption to the renewable resources. And we can also try to cut the trips or the flight trips as an individual as well as an organization. And it is very good that since the pandemic, we have seen that most of the organization has limited the amount of travels to the meetings or to the workshop. So this can also play a role in reducing the amount of greenhouse gases. And also moving from the energy, most energy consumption equipment to more of the energy efficient equipment. And also icons here showing the solar panels. So moving from the coal-based electricity towards the more renewable resources to generate energy can also lead into a more reduction of the greenhouse gases. and also moving to the electric vehicle. And in order also to manage the waste with the 3 R's, where you can recycle, reuse, and also reduce. And as an organization, again, one thing that we can do as an organization is also to avoid a single-use plastic. That can also be implemented as an individual, where you are avoiding using of plastic and you're using the renewable paper bags or renewable bags for the grocery and so on. And also by planting more of the tree, which can also play a role in absorbing the amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You can move to the next slide. Thank you. So this slide is more of the same information that I highlighted from the previous slide, but on this one, I mostly focus on the organizational level, where we can follow the we can follow the 4 steps, where you have to replace, reduce, avoid, or offset. And then where in replacing, the organization should also look towards replacing the coal-based electricity to move to renewable, and also move from the fuel car into the electric car, and also the generator, which most of the parks use it for electricity, into renewable resources. And some of the things that can be avoided is also waste. So we can also avoid a waste and also use resources sustainably, and also try to reduce some cut. And we have seen through the assessment that SANParks has already set kilometers that as an employee, we are allowed to drive on a monthly basis. So since that initiative, we've seen a little bit of a decline on the SANParks vehicle kilometers or SANParks vehicle emission related, which is also playing a little bit of a role in reducing the emission. And also I've mentioned about the flight, even through the COVID, and also the policies that has been implemented during the COVID levels, where no one is allowed to travel, and all those limits on the travel. So it also play a role in reducing the greenhouse gases. And also you can try to use our resources efficiently. And some of the things that can be avoided, I've mentioned about the tumble dry, and also try to avoid flight ticket or reduce the amount of the flights travel, and also avoid wasting resources. When it comes to offset, which is the 4th topic, it will be to store more carbon. So Dr. Masubelele has already mentioned about the rehabilitation that is an organization we are doing in order to store more of the carbon, and we can also purchase verified carbon units. Thank you. I think that is it from me.
Thanks, Bozi. This is just the last slide to say that a lot of people in SANParks are involved in the whole dealing with the emissions. The technical team led by our managing executive, Property Mukwena, has really been instrumental in terms of getting energy and other waste measures put in place in the different parks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masubelele and Avhavhudzani, for a very insightful presentation. I know that it was a lot of technical stuff, but you deal with technical stuff, unfortunately, in your work, and you have presented to us in quite an understandable way. You must also realize that most of the guys that actually enlisted tonight or registered to participate in this webinar are all serious environmentalists. And it is really heartwarming to see and to note that SANParks are definitely serious about reducing their carbon footprint, and that they go through all of this trouble by actually developing a specific section to deal with the reduction of carbon emissions. So thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. It was in the chat box, there are many comments about how interesting it was, and it was really a pleasure listening to you. I'm going to deal with a few questions. Some of the questions, I must admit, were posted before answers were given. For instance, we had a question regarding plastic bottles and plastic bags in park shops. And Avhavhudzani, I think you've mentioned that that's one of your focus areas, to do away with plastic and to rather go for more like paper bags and all of that. So please allow me to go through the questions quickly. There's one interesting question, and I hopefully you will have that. I think it's very scientific though. And the question is, by what percentage do your natural ecosystems absorb carbon dioxide? In other words, how much impact in reducing greenhouse gas does this strategy have? I'm not sure, Doc, which one of you will be able to answer this for us.
Thanks, Willie. I think this is one component that we haven't really dealt with appropriately in SANParks. We do have a few studies that are ongoing at the moment in terms of trying to quantify exactly that. And I would imagine because most of our ecosystem contributes nationally, some of these emissions that we focus on reducing would be essentially cancelled out by the, if you look at the total, basically, carbon emissions, basically, if you look at the total, you'll be able to pick up that in some instances, Kruger is so huge, and the amount of carbon that's absorbed within that system does play quite a significant role in reducing some of large amounts of the emissions. But what we wanted was essentially to get the organization really motivating to go for net zero. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I'm going to summarize a few questions with one answer, because comments were made regarding the use of renewable resources and all of that. And maybe I can just pose the question in a way by asking, does SANParks, do you foresee that you will rather opt to buy in renewable energy from suppliers than to actually convert some of the camps to produce its own renewable energy, or is it going to be a bit of both?
I'm not sure if some of my colleagues are here. Danny from Kruger, she might be able to provide a better comment, but what I know certainly, and in the strategy, is that there would be a bit of both in terms of, for Kruger, they have done an assessment already in terms of these camps that have the most energy emissions. They they have already set up and evaluated basically what it would cost and what type of battery and renewable energy would be required for each of those parks. But there's also the public-private processes of tendering in terms of buying also from, supporting communities, especially close to the parks, who, often regulations might be restrictive in where you put certain, interventions, even including renewable energy. So in that regard, the Green Energy Strategy anticipates that there will be this public-private partnerships that SANParks will strike with organizations and communities.
Thank you very much for that. And then we've got someone that made an interesting observation during a visit to Kruger. He basically states that during my visit to Kruger in 2007, deliveries of linen and towels to bungalows in most camps was done by battery-driven golf cart type vehicles. But during my 2022 visit, most of the deliveries, if not all, of linen and towels were done by petrol or diesel-driven bakkies. And he just makes a comment that this looks like a backward step, and he asks if you have maybe any comment on that statement.
I'm not sure, Wuzi, you want to take this one? Because, yeah, at individual park level, depending on who's responsible in some instances, then those type of things do happen. But it's for the tourists, the public, to make us basically account and aware that those type of interventions, are priority, and we should not get away with them, and we should stick to using fossil fuel less intensive vehicles or interventions.
All right, thanks, Dr. Masubelele. I think maybe just to add on what you mentioned. So in those previous years, I guess it was this SANParks owned vehicle. And then after some time, I think somewhere 2010, if not mistaken, then we moved from SANParks owned vehicle to the fleet, which was Vuswa. So I suspect maybe it was one of the reason why they get rid of those battery cars into Vuswa. And then, however, by 2022, we moved back to SANParks vehicle. So I still stand with Dr. Masubelele that maybe as a park or as an organization, we must look more into the fuel efficiency car. Yeah, I think that is my.
Thank you, Avhavhudzani. Yeah, it will be. I think it will be great if we can go back to golf carts again, because surely that that must make a huge, especially in a park like Kruger, huge contribution to reducing the carbon footprint. Then there were quite a number of questions regarding renewable energy, and especially in the case where SANParks uses solar panels, about the batteries. Some people made comments that the batteries need to be replaced regularly, etc., etc. But there were also a few questions about battery replacements in itself poses quite an environmental threat. And the questions revolve around what are your plans as SANParks to deal with the disposal of batteries in a responsible way.
Thanks, Veli. Yeah, that's what we're picking up. I mean, for some of the parks that we have already put in renewable energy, parks like Tankwa, for example, where it's completely well, more than 90% reliant on renewable energy, except when fuel might be used, the generator might be used. We've seen that the park management essentially works with the private institutions that have been contracted to set up the renewable energy system to get rid of those batteries and try and to acquire some of the more efficient ones. The hydrogen type, I think, is the one that is, according to reports, it's much better and lasts longer than the ones that we currently see we had in the in our parks. So obviously there's cost implications as well associated with that. So we need to actually, when we do the specifications for tendering, that those type of things are included in the specs, so that we don't ultimately get some of those batteries that won't last, that need also to be replaced very quickly.
Thank you, Doc. Just also another slightly changed question. It's basically a consolidation of a few questions, and the question is: does SANParks, are there camps in Kruger where you actually generate more energy than from renewable sources like Lower Sabi, for instance, than what is needed by those camps? Can you perhaps just bring us in the picture as far as that is concerned?
Unfortunately, I don't have a comment. I think our technical team is much better equipped to provide a better answer.
Yeah. Now, I knew I would put you on the spot with that question, so you are forgiven, Doc. Obviously you can't have all of that, and like I said in the introduction, you are only part of a team, and I think your main focus is in the Cape cluster. So no problem with that. Just another question from Rosemary is: do you have recycling plants in the national parks?
Budzi, do you want to take that one, or?
I can take it, and then you may add what I was saying. So with the recycling plants, we don't really have more of the recycling. However, in the parks, so they do more, especially the socio-economic transformation division. They do encourage recycling in the parks, so we have the recycling stations. But however, it has been, when we did the assessment, because most of the recycling activities were not running properly, and when we were doing the assessment, we communicated with the people who were responsible for the recycling, and we found out that it has been a challenge in most of the parks, because they can collect all the recyclable materials, but it's very difficult for the park to transport them to the recycling station outside the park. And there was also an initiative where they encouraged the nearby communities to come and collect the recycling objects from the park. And it came to a point where some of the projects from the community, they couldn't afford to hire the car from their area to come and collect the recycling resources from the park to the recycling station. So it has not really been active, but that is one of the recommendations that we came up with to say, let's also deal with how we manage our waste in the parks. So Mmoto, do you want to add on that?
I think you covered most of it, and I would just say that it varies across the different parks. Like Buzi said, what we've seen in the arid parks is that distances to the nearest towns or to the dumping site it's far. So the cost sometimes of doing that recycling and taking it there becomes higher than what the people who are, the size of the waste that the person would have collected and brought to the recycling site. So it varies, because in Kruger there is a recycling plant. In Golden Gate also there is one. So our waste is our Achilles, I have to say, that we really need to deal with. And it starts with setting up the proper labeling and stuff for people but also for the people when they come to the park to adhere to those signs and help us really separate waste, but also clearly deal with the waste, because it's really a big issue that we had when we did the assessment and going to the parks and trying to source out some data. So we don't, the data that we got was developed using different methodology, and I think an adequate account of measurable waste would be a way to go. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about it.
Thank you very much, Doc. And I think I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much for, like I said, Dr. Masubelele and Avhavhudzani, for a most interesting talk. There were a lot of comments made and sort of advice given and questions about first use plastic bottles. I think, Avhavhudzani, you have indicated that you guys are working on that. I know that in the ideal world, you would have opted to go for a much greener footprint immediately, but it's expensive, and unfortunately it takes time. And we realize that and acknowledge that, but we would like once again to thank SANParks for the fact that it's clear from the presentation that you guys are serious about reducing it and that you are doing a great job. So thank you so much for a most insightful presentation, and we would like to wish you best of luck with the good work that you are doing. I would like to, just before I close down, I would like to remind all of us, and I think you have showed that in your final slides, that we all have a responsibility to reduce this footprint, and that we as visitors, honorary rangers and tourists at our parks can also contribute a lot to help you to reduce that. I certainly, and I say tongue in cheek, I hope that we as HRs and tourists to the parks won't follow that lion approach, Doc, because, unfortunately, if Lions depends on Eskom to get more fire up their spine, it's going to take a long time. I think they're going to remain lazy forever. But be that as it may, it was very interesting, and I would like to thank everybody for joining us during for this presentation. I would like to invite our guests, HRs, and guests to join us on the 6th of July. We will present a webinar on the Richtersveld National Park, and we are going to focus specifically on the uniqueness of the park, the conservation challenges of the park, and reasons why it should be on everyone's bucket list. So hopefully we will get you guys up and running. Unfortunately, you will increase the footprint in South Africa when you start up your vehicle and visit the Richtersveld National Park, but hopefully it will bring a different dimension of the Richtersveld National Park to all of you. So please join us on the 6th of July. And then, like I said in the beginning, if we are really dependent on donations and people supporting us in our endeavor to support SANParks. So on the left-hand side, you will see there's a QR code. If you would like to donate online, you're more than welcome to scan that in with your device, or if you want to do a snap scan donation, on the right-hand side of the slide, there is also a snap scan QR code. We are going to keep this slide up for a minute or two in order for you to do that. And if you would like more information about the SANParks Honorary Rangers, you're welcome to visit our website, www.sanparksvolunteers.org, and you will be able to get all the information about our organization. Once again, thank you, colleagues, for the presentation, and also for our guests that joined us during this evening. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.